Good morning. This is actually take two. I made this video last night at 9:30 and I have to redo it because it didn't upload. At 9:30 I made a video. That was probably my first mistake. You guys know I go to bed early. So anyway, this is a graph of sine, which is in blue, and cosine, which is in yellow. We're going to learn how to graph tomorrow. Today we're just going to learn about amplitude and period. This is going to do with classwork 16. So anyway, these are the equations of sine and cosine. If you see, we have an A in the equation. A is just like in any graph we've ever done. A is your vertical stretch or compression. If A is negative, that means it's a reflection over the graph. So A stands for your amplitude. Amplitude is the distance from the midpoint of a graph. Okay, it's the distance, and distance is always positive. That's why I have absolute value around the A. It's the distance from the midpoint. Now, if you look at this blue, the sine graph is in blue. I'm not even sure if you can see the cosine graph is in yellow. So we're just going to focus on the sine graph right now. The midpoint is the x-axis. Now, this is not always true on graphs. Okay, if a graph has been stretched or shifted up or down, it's not always the x-axis. So anyway, if you look at this x-axis, that cuts the sine graph in the middle. So what is the midpoint here, or what is the distance from here, which is the maximum value, or from here, that's the minimum value of the sine graph? Well, the distance is 1, 2. So the amplitude here would be 2. If the distance is 2 from here to here, or the distance is 2 from here to here. So the amplitude of this blue graph right here is 2. That's your amplitude, just that simple. Okay, that's the distance from the midpoint. Okay, the period, and this is the formula for period. A period is like a cycle. A cycle is how long does it take you to complete like a circle? Now, if you think about it, a unicircle is 2 pi. Well, it's not always, 2 pi is not always the answer, but look. So on this blue graph, because they're not always the same, if I go from here to here, that's pi. Well, that's half a circle. If I go from here to here, there's 2 pi. So on this particular graph, this is a half a circle, this is a full circle. So this graph is 2 pi, that's one complete cycle. Again, we're not doing graphs today, but I needed you to kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about. So to find the period, which we're doing from equations, it's 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. So your b tells you the period, or how long it takes to make a complete cycle. Okay. Down here when we start doing graphs, we do this little saying, so I'm not going to explain it now. The complete cycle, this is another trick when we're looking at graphs. So for the sine graph, if I start here, oh, and by the way, this is very important. Sine graphs always go through the origin. So to complete a cycle, it starts at 0, and if it's not a reflection, it goes 0, max, 0, min, 0. That's called a complete cycle. So in other words, 0 starts in the origin, maximum height, back to 0, minimum, and then back to 0. That's a complete cycle. For cosine, cosine does not start at the origin. If it's not a reflection, it starts at its maximum height. If it is a reflection, it starts at its minimum. Okay. So anyway, let's show you what you're doing for your classwork today. You're finding the amplitude and the period, or how long it takes to do a cycle, from equations. So down here at the bottom here, I have an equation, and to find the amplitude, you just start with your A. Well, that's pretty easy. So what is the absolute value of A? So my amplitude for this one is, well, my distance from the midpoint is just 3. That's it. That's it. So to find the period, you look at your B, which is right here, and you take the formula, and you go 2 pi divided by, your b is 2, and so you can see that your 2's would cancel out. So for this particular graph, instead of going all the way to 2 pi to complete the cycle, it would actually do its cycle all the way only to pi. So it would be a much shorter, it'd go like this, and that would be the cycle. So it would be thinner to go 0 max, 0 min, oops, sorry, it would go like this. There's my pi. So that's the answer for the period. So this complete cycle would be done in pi, right there. Okay, so that would be the complete cycle or the period. There's your period or complete cycle. All right, so then for here, sorry, I had to squeeze in the y equals. Your a here is -1. So the absolute value of -1, so your a would be 1. Now that means that would be a reflection for cosine. So if you can see my yellow up here, cosine, so instead of starting here, it would start at -1. So that's your distance from the midpoint right here. Now your period here, there's your b. So to find out your cycle, you just take 2 pi divided by 4. So then that would simplify. So my period for this one would be pi over 2. So there's your period right there. That's my period. There's your, oh, boy, I'm hoping you can see that one. Gotta look at the, barely, nope. Move that up a little bit. Okay, pi over 2, period. Okay, so this last one, it's not that bad. So if you look at your a on this one, if you remember, anything between 0 and 1 is called a compression. So this graph would be really skinny, be less than 1. So my a here is 2/3 absolute value. So there's your distance from the midpoint would be 2/3. So it wouldn't even make it up to 1. And this is a sine graph, so I know it would cut through the origin. It would start at the origin. Okay, and then to find your period here, so look, we have to go 2 pi divided by 1/3, and we've already done some of these before in a previous lesson, so I'm going to have to multiply by 3/1, remember, keep flip change or whatever that is, so this cancels out, and then I go 2 pi times 3, which gives me 6 pi. So my period here, I'm going to abbreviate period because I'm into the door handle, is 6 pi. So there's my amplitude, there's my period. So that's how you do it, find the amplitude and period from these 3 equations. So that's part of your classwork. Then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to do the same thing, but you're going to do it from looking at equations. So I had to cover this up because when I did it last night, I wrote all over this. So here we have the equations we have equations like this I know is a sine graph because it goes through the origin. This one I know is a cosine graph because it does not go through the origin. So I'm looking for the amplitude, period, and then I'm going to write the equation. All right, so on this graph, looking for the amplitude, I go, okay, let's find the midpoint here. We got to find the midpoint so I can find the amplitude. Well, this one I can see it's cut through the x-axis. The midline is the x-axis on this one too. Because look, it goes 1, 2 up, and then it goes 1, 2 down. So my midline is the x-axis. So my amplitude is 2. The distance from the midline is 2. So now I can see, and I covered that up because I had already written on it, what is my period? You actually know your cycle for this one. Your cycle, look, if this is 1/4, and that would be 3/4, so this has to be 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, so this would be 4/4. Well, 4/4 is pi. So I completed my there's a half a circle, full circle, that's 1 one full cycle or period, so that's pi. So I completed my period in pi. Remember, we're looking for the b. So you would do this. You would go, okay, 2 pi over b equals pi. So we're looking for the b. Okay, so now it's like a proportion. So proportions, you have to crisscross multiply. So I can put pi over 1. And when I crisscross multiply, I get 2 pi equals pi over b. Sorry, it doesn't look like a 2. And then to get b by itself, I just divide by pi. The pi's cancel out here, the pi's cancel out here. So I get b equals 2. So you know your b now. So now I know my a, I know my b is 2, and so it's going to be easy to write the equation. Now remember, this is signed because it goes through 0. So here's my equation right here. I got my a, I got my b, so my equation would be y equals 2 sine of 2x. And that's your final. There's 3 steps. You find your a, you find your b, and then you write your equation. Okay, let's do the last one. So I know this is not a sine graph because it does not go through the origin. So when I do this, woo. So I already wrote this last night, so I didn't want to do the graph again. So my midline for this one, this is how I found my midline. I counted the highest and the lowest point. The highest and the lowest point were 6 apart. So I divided it by 2, so I found it was 3. So I go up here and I go, so here's my midline. So I got 3 up and then 3 up. So I know my A was 3. That's the distance from the midline. Then to find my B, so to complete a cycle, I know this is cosine. Okay, complete a cycle, I went, okay, well this is pi. That's 3 pi. So I went 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi. So complete a cycle here, this had to be 4 pi. So to find a b, I go, all right, 2 pi over b equals 4 pi. So again, to find my b, crisscross multiply, 2 pi equals 4 pi b, divide by 4 pi. All right, so this cancels out. B equals 1/2. So b equals 1/2. So then when I write my equation, I go, all right, so y equals, a is 3, cosine 1/2 x. But now here's something very important. This is the last thing I got to tell you. Do you notice that cosine starts down? It doesn't start up. So this was an actual reflection. So this would be a negative. So there's your equation, and I hope you understand. If you have questions, check my meet times. I'm changing them a little bit, hoping that you guys will come at a different time. Good morning. Peace out.